They were sitting up there on their high horse saying, no, we're right, you're wrong, we know what's best for the game, you don't know what you like, you don't know what you want. And so people said, okay, well, I want to quit. And then they quit. And then Blizzard was like, whoa, 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 wait, we're listening, we're listening, we're listening. We are, I promise. Yo, what's up? So if you don't know, Blizzard has made some changes going into 9.1.5 that players have been asking for since the beta of Shadowlands, or since they knew about any of these things in the game. And they've also released kind of an apology, not apology along with it. So I thought I would go over that here and then talk about if I think that this is good for the game or bad for the game, and if I think that this will be a permanent shift from Blizzard or a temporary shift. So that's what I'm going to go over. If you like this kind of content or you like some of my other content, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. I'll be doing a lot more Activision Blizzard stuff as well as some things for other games and other companies. So yeah, just stay tuned to that. But with that, we're just going to go ahead and get into the video here. So it starts off and says, in the next few days, we will be updating the public test realm with a first look at 9.1.5 alongside featured updates like new time walking experiences. This time we're revisiting Legion with a couple of twists. These 0.5 patches falling in between full content tiers present an opportunity to focus on balance and revision of core systems based on feedback of data from the season so far. Patch 9.1.5 will include several significant changes to the Shadowlands Covenant systems in particular. So this beginning part is just kind of a preface. Obviously, it doesn't mean much. But I do want to point out that this part right here where they say that these 0.5 patches present an opportunity to focus on balance and revision of core systems based on feedback. Since when? Because as long as I've known, there's been things that they've put on the patch in the test server that people have said is going to be a problem. People have said we don't like this. People have said we want this to change. And it rarely, if ever, gets changed. I mean, the one thing I can think about immediately is the tuning of some of the legendaries from 9.1, and then how in the test server and on the tournament realms, people were able to choose their keys that they wanted to run instead of getting like a random one. And people have been asking for a way to focus keys for a long time, and Blizzard has never ever listened to that. So those are the ones I'm most familiar with, but I also know that, again, in the beta of Shadowlands, people were saying like these Covenant systems are going to be a problem. Conduit energy is an issue. We don't want that in the game at all. And, you know, Blizzard hasn't listened yet so far. So this part, I just don't believe them because they never listen until it's too late, as we're about to see. So for the first point, once you've reached a high renown threshold, you will thereafter be able to freely switch among any of the 4 covenants without cooldown or restriction, as well as use cosmetic rewards that you have earned from one covenant even if you are currently a member of a different one. Both the covenant switching and the use of cosmetic rewards will also apply to alts once the renown threshold is reached on one character. So this has been a problem for a while, where people have found a gear set they like or whatever and then switched to a new covenant, and that gear set has, you know, gone away because you can't have the gear set from a covenant that you're not currently a part of. Now that's the most minor problem, but it is something that people have complained about, especially completionists or people who really care about their appearance. But one of the more major things is this idea that you can switch between your covenants freely. And for most people, it just comes down to if a new legendary is tuned to become better if a new legendary is tuned to become better and that legendary is more facilitated with a different covenant, then we switch. Let's think about the balanced druid issue that came up with patch 9.1, where not only did they have to change their legendary because the domination sockets, but they actually had to change their covenant as well to go to Venthyr because Venthyr did more damage. Well, they didn't. Now they didn't have to do that. It was just like simmed better and was the overall better DPS. And of course, we saw in the Race to World first that it wasn't necessarily the best option to switch to that so early because the Venthyr Druids had a lot more learning to do than the Nightfade Druids, and that's a major reason that Echo actually ended up winning. But regardless, they sim better, and most players are probably going to go for what they think is going to do the most damage. And when you're not able to switch between the covenants freely, it became a real big problem where people would have to spend, you know, a day out of 2 weeks simultaneously kind of grinding out this bar to fill up and then being able to switch after that. But the problem was that, one, it took too long, but like actual real life time, because you had to wait between resets to even do the next part of it. But it also was kind of annoying because you had to do this needless grind. Even if you're switching from a covenant to one that you've had before, it still made you redo all of this stuff, and it was super annoying. And even lore wise, I know Bellular talked about this all the time, because in the lore, all the covenants have come together and they're now working as hard as they can to defeat the jailer as one team. So it doesn't make sense that we're kind of locked to one. It doesn't make sense that we're kind of locked to one covenant. And that was even during 9.0. And the response from Blizzard was always that, well, it's not that easy to just implement something like this due to like the technological aspects of doing this, as well as like what we have going down the pipeline. They refer to that. And then a lot of players kind of echo this. And I would, if you're unsure of what they mean by pipeline, there's two possible things they can mean in the scenario. One, they can mean the start to finish process of developing a piece of code into deploying it into production. And that could start from like whoever starts writing it to being reviewed, to going into some kind of secret test server, to maybe even the public test server, and then on to live. That could be what they mean by the pipeline. Another thing that Blizzard can mean by the pipeline is their actual continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, which is basically an automated set of software that once you push something into a repo for the code, it'll automatically run all the tests and stuff. And usually that requires some kind of review as well. So they're very similar, but those could be the two contexts. I'm assuming they mean the former just because of how like this thing was initially started. I'm assuming they mean the former just because of how casually they kind of speak about it, and I doubt they're talking about something as like specific as CI/CD. But for this, people are saying like, well, the pipeline doesn't like facilitate that kind of thing, but that's just not true, because when you are on a team of software developers, it's not like every piece of software has to go in like a backlog and then go in order. There can be different levels of priority. And if Blizzard had decided that this was a priority, then they could have actually pushed this out immediately. They could have just like hot fixed this like they do all the time. You might see live hot fixes that they do, like they did when Echo was doing their weird strat against Sylvanas. They actually did a live hotfix. There was no need to repatch because the game patched during live time. They can actually do that. Though, of course, you don't always want to do that because sometimes it can cause unforeseen bugs, but they can actually do that. So the idea that they have to follow this incredibly strict pipeline from start to finish and there's no way to circumvent that is not exactly true. On top of that, you also see just normal hotfixes all the time where you just open up your client and then randomly there's like a 2 megabyte patch that you just have to do really quick. That's another thing that they can do. That those are like high priority things that needed to go through the pipeline that couldn't wait for a 0.5 patch. But even if we exclude that, then this has been asked for since the beta again. So even if it wasn't in 9.0, they could have put it in 9.0.5, which would have been able to go through a full pipeline that they didn't have to prioritize it over a lot of other things. They could have just kept it in the backlog until they were ready to do that, and it could have been easily put into 9.0.5, or they could have put it into 9.1, and they did neither of those things. Another issue that I just remembered right now, of course, is the Soul Ash. A lot of people have been asking to not force us to run Torghast for the Soul Ash, and they've said the same thing. We just can't put it in other things. But it's really as simple as adding the Soul Ash to the drop tables for any of the bosses in the raid, or any of the bosses in like a Mythic Plus, or adding it to the drop table for after a PvP game. It is actually quite simple for them to be able to do these things, especially if they're not forced hotfixes. If they can put it into a 0.5 patch or a major patch, either way, these things would be actually quite simple for them to implement. But let's pretend that the technology, or however ingrained covenants were with forcing the switch, was so hard for them to actually just rewrite. What they could have actually done is just changed the values for what they were. For example, instead of requiring 2,000 experience or whatever the bar that they had to fill up for to get the next to get the covenant you want to switch to accept you more, they could have just made that value 0. These values are just stored in a file somewhere or in the database somewhere, and it's not that hard for them to just change those values. And then they could have also changed the required number of days and like resets between those things. They could have just changed that value as well, because that's just a number stored somewhere as well. So they could have actually just changed these things. They wouldn't have been actually that difficult for them to do, especially if we're talking about a major patch or a 0.5 patch. But they even could have done those things in a hotfix if they really cared about it, or they really thought it was a priority. They could have, but they only think of it as a priority now because a lot of people have been leaving the game. These changes obviously wouldn't be happening if people were still playing the game, because Blizzard has this idea that they're always correct, and they won't see that they're not correct until people show them by, in this case, leaving the game. So if you are a person who says like, oh, well, this was just like technologically unfeasible for them to fix until now, do you actually think that's the case? Or do you think that they're doing this now because, people are complaining about it so much? And I want to point out, of course, that I don't know everything about Blizzard's tech stack. I don't know everything about their development process. Obviously, I've never worked for the company. But I do know that a lot of these things should be fairly simple to fix. And if they implemented them in separate ways, like, for example, if that number that needs to be changed is implemented in some crazy, like, spaghetti code complex way that made it impossible for them to just change a single value in their database or in some file somewhere to make it so that that bar actually only developed to 0 so they could automatically switch, then that is a problem with their development and the way that they have this set up, because that should not be anything more complex than changing the value there, to be honest. So there's that, but then we have more changes as well. Okay, so we have conduit energy is being removed. Conduits will be freely swappable without restrictions. Now, this has been asked for forever. This is such a weird punishment system that no one ever needed in the game, and Blizzard were kind of just up their own ass with what they thought this actually provided for the player base. Even if there are some players who want to switch every single dungeon or every single boss or whatever in a raid, like, it doesn't really matter. Those players are going to want to do that. And I don't know why you would punish them for wanting to do such a thing, unless you're afraid that this somehow becomes the meta. But it never really would, because usually the only time this happened was when people wanted to switch between content. So if you wanted to go from raid to Mythic Plus to PvP to maybe doing some world quests, like, that's the only time this conduit energy would actually need to change. So they were punishing people for trying to do different types of content. And so that's why I feel like this was actually always bad. And they never actually knew what its implementation in the game actually did for people. They just kind of assumed, or maybe put on the blinders in this case, for this being a good idea. That's my opinion. Of course, it could be that I'm completely wrong, and this actually stopped so many bad metas from forming, that people would switch every single raid boss and all that. But I highly doubt it, and we will see, I guess, in the next coming weeks if people start to do that, where it becomes a very toxic meta where people are doing this. I don't think it will be, though. And then we have, when playing alternate characters, if you have already completed a given Covenant's campaign on a different character, you'll be able to immediately earn the renown and third soulbind unlocked without needing to replay the full narrative arc. Now, I've been asking for this for a while as well, because for me, I had multiple alts, and it was incredibly annoying for me to finish the Venthyr campaign on my Paladin and then go do it on my Priest and have to redo the entire thing. That was super, super annoying. I don't want to have to do that every single time, especially when only the reason for playing these campaigns is for the narrative and for the story. And in my opinion, the story wasn't even that great, but even if it was fantastic, how many times can you play through a story before you get bored, especially in quick succession? Like, I understand if you love the story and you play through it every year or so because you just want to relive that story, completely understand. But do you want to relive that story every couple weeks? I don't think you do, especially if, in your opinion, it's a bad story. So this is a fantastic change, and I wish they had done it earlier, because this would have saved me a fuck ton of time. But again, this has been something that people have asked for a really long time, and they did kind of do some similar things in the beginning where you could skip part of it, where you could skip the introduction to the Covenant area and stuff like that. But this really should have been in the game from the beginning. But not only that, I actually think this should have gone further, and they should let you skip the Maw intro area and just go right into Threads of Fate or right into questing in the zones, because that Maw area is, of course, it forces you to do all of these cuts. It forces you to do all this dialogue and stuff that you might not want to do. It takes up a lot of time, and it gets a bit boring after you've done it, 5 times. So I also think that they need to add in a skip for that too. I think this is a good change, but I think all of these are actually good changes, but I actually think that they just came way, way too late. These things should have been in the game, in my opinion, in 9.0. They shouldn't have had to wait until 9.1.5, which at this point is 10 months after launch, right? And probably a year since people have been asking for these changes. So this is way too late for them to listen. 10 months later and a month or two after there's been a max exodus from their game, it's a bad look. And of course, it shows that they're going to listen, at least for now. I'll talk about whether I think this is going to be an overall change towards the end of this video, but this is actually a problem that they don't listen until there's a major issue, which is expected. It would be even more of a problem if they still didn't listen, obviously, but the fact that it has to take some major crazy thing for them to start listening is just ridiculous. And so now we can actually look at, one, this is kind of like their apology here, but then also they made a follow-up post which we'll also look at. So we're going to look at both of those because I think they're important to read. Keep in mind that these are just my opinions, so anything I say is not, of course, 100% verifiable truth. I'm just going to be talking about my opinions, what I think about the game, and what I think about these statements. While we hope that many players will be pleased at the increased accessibility and freedom for the experimentation these changes will permit, we know that you might be wondering why we didn't make adjustments like this sooner. Yes, we've been wondering that for a long time. After all, a large portion of the community has been vocal about wanting to see these changes along these lines since mid-2020. Yep. When Shadowlands was still in beta. Yeah, exactly. So people have been asking for this for a really, really, really long time. When it comes to the limitations of Covenant switching, millions of players experience Shadowlands for the first time through the lens of a Covenant choice. Okay, fine. If this choice felt more meaningful, then maybe that would make sense, but it's just borrowed power, right? It doesn't feel like it's going to be permanent. It doesn't really fit that RPG feel, and it's not balanced correctly, and people didn't feel like they have to pick a specific Covenant just to do the most damage, then that would be different. And if it was a really good narrative choice, that would also be different. But again, it didn't really change the way people experience the story, especially the people who like the story, because they're going to play through all the Covenant campaigns anyway. So it's kind of weird that you forced this weird switching, and it's kind of weird that you forced from the beginning this like hardline choice when you knew that it was going to be really hard to balance this kind of thing, and you knew that people were only going to pick based on the damage anyway. That's really the only reason people picked, is like the tuning of the Covenant for their class. Very, very few people picked for other reasons, okay? But and that would have not been possible had the choice carried less weight for the outset. Well, that's just not true from what I said, but also your change requires it to be at high Covenant renown, right? So what if that renown was 40? Then it would have still had the same implications if you just made this happen at renown 40 instead, right? Like this change, like you're lying. It feels like you're lying to me, because the change that you implemented could have been done at renown 40 and had the same effect that it has now. It wouldn't have changed this beginning outset, because renown was already time gated anyway, and you had to complete the campaign to get all the way up to renown 40. So that's just a lie. It's a lie. Nevertheless, after the conclusion of the Chains of Domination campaign, the Covenants are united against the Jailer. Yes, this actually happened in 9.0, right? By the time you were at renown 40 and you'd completed your Covenant campaign, they were already starting to come together to defeat the Jailer. So this was already happening. And revisiting player feedback in that context has led us to reevaluate our approach. Now, they didn't revisit player feedback. They knew what the player feedback was all along. What happened was players finally said, we quit. We don't like what you're doing. We wanted this. You didn't do this. We quit. So they didn't really revisit. It's not like they were like listening the whole time. And they're like, yeah, that's an interesting idea. It was like they were sitting up there on their high horse saying, no, we're right. You're wrong. We know what's best for the game. You don't know what you like. You don't know what you want. And so people said, okay, well, I want to quit. And then they quit. And then Blizzard was like, whoa, wait. We're listening. We are, I promise. That's what it feels like. In terms of the day-to-day player experience, the advantage of a rigid division between covenants have diminished since Shadowlands launched. I don't think there ever was advantages to this. The only advantage that they can even claim, which they said up here, if there were more advantages, they said one advantage, and that was that it made the choice feel more meaningful. And again, I explain that this could have been done by making it renown 40. People would have had to play through all of the campaign anyway, and they could have done this later. That's all I'm saying. So this feels very, 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 very hollow, in my opinion. While the downsides, feeling disadvantaged in certain types of content, feeling disadvantaged in all types of content because you have to make a choice between content. The real choice here isn't between covenants, it's between types of content you want to do. Or having to choose between mechanical advantages or aesthetics. Again, there are some people who play for aesthetics, but most people are going to play for these mechanical advantages. And you didn't have to choose between... Sometimes you did have to choose between mechanical advantages and aesthetics. Of course, that was annoying. Like, let's say you really love the Paladin Kyrian set, but you're going to go Paladin Venthyr just because of how much better it is. Then, yeah, maybe that would be like a pretty good... But this option was always way less important than the mechanical advantages. Like, let's take a look at Demon Hunter, for example. If you're a Demon Hunter and you want to run PvP, you're going to go Night Fae. Oh, but if you want a tank, you're going to go Kyrian, right? So, I mean, that's the thing, right? It was mostly choosing between mechanical advantages for types of content rather than mechanical advantages and aesthetics, but this was another aspect. So you basically made people choose between mechanical advantages and other mechanical advantages and aesthetics. It's just type of content and aesthetics. They're trying to soften the blow here. That balance of factors no longer justifies the original limitations of the covenant switching. I don't think it was ever justified. So in 9.1.5, we're looking to provide a way to circumvent them. This should have been done already. Honestly, I think this should be a hotfix right now. I don't think that they should wait for this to even happen, to be honest. Conduit energy, however, is a different story. The system simply has not played out the way we hoped it would. We should have heeded community feedback and taken a different direction a year ago. You should have done that for all of these. So what this means is that now they agree that conduit energy is bad, but they don't agree that covenant switching was ever a necessity in the game. Or they don't agree that it was at the beginning. They think it might be now, but they don't think at the beginning it mattered. When I disagree, I think it always mattered here. I think this always mattered too. The system simply has not played out the way we hoped it would, and you should have seen that so much, like a long time ago. How could you not see that 3 months, 4 months, 6 months into the expansion? I don't know why it took so long for this to be seen. A majority of players largely ignore the system and are unaffected by it, while the minority who want to engage in multiple content types competitively feel constrained by it. Exactly. Overall, that adds up to a negative experience. Conduit energy isn't really making the game better in any appreciable way. Of course not. So we're removing the system entirely. Now, this is another problem, right? Players have been saying this for the entire Shadowlands experience. Why did they only listen now? Again, it's because people are leaving the game. As for Covenant campaign skip for alts and the ability to freely swap covenants on alts, the change is one outgrowth of many ongoing discussions within the development team, focused on feedback that at times players feel that WoW content they most enjoy is locked behind experiences that aren't nearly as appealing to them. Not only that, you're wasting my time by making me redo all of this bullshit. And not only are you wasting my time, so it would be one thing if I could just go grind out all the stuff and then do it in one day and then switch, but you also time get it between 2 resets. It's multiple factors at play here that you literally didn't listen to the players on any of it. Some of that feedback revolves around different playstyles and content types, but a consistent theme is that the experiences that were fun the first time through start to lose their luster and repeat playthroughs on alts. Yes, this is what I'm talking about. How many times can you play through the campaign, or how many times can you play through that Maw scenario before it becomes tedious? I'd say the second time it was already tedious, especially when required for power progression. Exactly. When people just want to get more powerful, they don't really care about the story that much. They don't want to relive that experience. They just want to like level, right? And making them do these things that like kind of shoehorn them into one thing that they have to do is really annoying. So I don't know why they didn't also add a Maw skip here, to be honest. So just as the Threads of Fate system exists to allow players to skip the level up zone narrative on subsequent playthroughs, we want to give max level players a similar option to avoid having to play Covenant campaigns they've already done. Good. This should have been done at beta. As the 9.1 and also people, this happens every expansion. People want to be able to skip that beginning zone. People want to be able to skip all of the beginning narratives because they're so boring. Like this always happens. They should always keep this in mind. They should always add a skip for this that's available after you've reached the max of whatever that first patch is. So for this, it should have been 40 renown unless you do all of this. Or completing the campaign lets you skip it every single time after that. Like completing whatever the thing is should let you skip it every single time. Every single time they need to do that. This is why games like Final Fantasy XIV are becoming really popular, because you can do everything on one character. You don't ever have to remake a new character to experience a different part of the game. Right? So it could be like in WoW, if I want to experience late game Demon Hunter and I want to experience late game Paladin, then I have to level up both characters through a lot of the same content. But in Final Fantasy XIV, if I want to experience late game Dark Knight and then I want to experience late game Black Mage, I can just level up that one character for each of those types. And the narrative never makes me redo that like entire story quest lane, because they offer things in the game that let me level up in different ways, where Blizzard really doesn't normally do that, except for Threads of Fate a little bit. But again, Final Fantasy has a bunch of other things that allow for this kind of thing. Now, I'm not saying that Blizzard needs to just copy everything Final Fantasy XIV does. I'm just offering an explanation for why this feels bad for a lot of people when other games have already solved this problem. As the 9.1.5 PTR progresses, we hope to roll out several other changes aimed at giving you more flexibility in choosing how you prefer to adventure in Azeroth. We'll have more details to follow as we finalize our plans. Stay tuned for full PTR notes in the near future, and we look forward to discussions and feedback to guide us in our ongoing improvements to World of Warcraft. All right, so now their follow-up says, over the past few weeks since we shared an update, the WoW team has been focused on the immediate future, both for our people and workplace, and what's next for our players too. As a part of that, the entire team came together to ask, what are the biggest things we're hearing are getting in the way of your fun? And what are the most impactful changes we can make to WoW today to fix that? Shadowlands Update 9.1.5 will be going on the PTR next week, and a lot of what you'll find in it is the direct result of your collective feedback. This should have always been the case, okay? What is the point of a PTR if it's not to get player feedback? Because it feels like every time players gave feedback, people didn't listen. This should have always been the case. I don't want to applaud them for doing something that should have been done in the first place. But it's like this. They're like trying to make us think that they're going to start listening now when they never have before. So I don't know. Why they even mention this at all. Like, this is already goes without saying. That's what a PTR is. It includes long asked for changes to make it easier to swap covenants and conduits, updates to make it so you don't need to repeat covenant campaigns on alts, new character customization options for some races that were lacking them, and many more changes to help you play the way you want. Good. More choice is always better. You should never force people to do things, and I think that's a big issue that the WoW team doesn't understand. It also updates to improve the game environment for our community, including additional changes to some content to better reflect our shared values, better visibility into the impact of your in-game reports of harassment. God bless, because if you reported someone for harassment, it would probably never get resolved unless you did it 90 times and then maybe a week or two later it would have got resolved and they'd get banned for like 5 minutes or something. And more serious penalties for people engaged in disruptive behavior. Good. This actually should have been happening a long time ago. We hope you'll see something from your own 9.1.5 wish list when we post the patch notes next week. And we'll keep listening, refining, and building on that as we continue PTR testing and development of what's next. For our Burning Crusade Classic players, we're excited to let you know that the first major content update, Overlords of Outland... Okay, I don't care about this anymore. Okay, so actually, going into this, I can see the changes that they made, and I see now that one of the changes I mentioned earlier and kind of, said that they needed to do, they did do. So this is actually great. They're listening better. I don't know if this is updated regularly. It says that it was posted on the 27th. So maybe this was recently updated and they got this feedback and this is something they're doing. Fantastic. Thank God. Okay, they're reintroducing island expeditions. Now, these weren't the best thing, but keeping systems in the game that were in the game before and allowing people to redo those things is very important, because it feels like after you do something, it no longer matters, right? Island expeditions don't matter anymore, but by keeping them in the game, they could still add things into island expeditions that could matter. And I think that's important. In 9.1.5, we are working on additional updates to a variety of class talents and class abilities, including conduits, rune carving, and covenant. I don't know what this entails, but that's great. Allied races such as Colterian Mechanomes and Dark Iron Dwarves, which had dungeon requirements to unlock them, will no longer need to complete associated quests to gain access to their races. Players will be able to skip it instead. Cool, I did all of this, but better late than never. Additional travel points in the Maw. Thank you. Remote anima turn-ins. I mean, I guess people have been asking for that. I don't really know if that's that important, but maybe. Transmogrification linking. Show off your complete transmog outfit in chat. That's really cool. Alt leveling improvements. As a variety of improvements will be introduced in support of smoother experience leveling alternate characters through Shadowlands, such as an additional rank of heirloom upgrades and improvements to Threads of Fate, such as additional Torghast as an option and Renown. So doing Torghast as an option is actually something that I thought needed to be in the game for a long time, because if I have to do Torghast anyway, then it makes sense that I can do Torghast while leveling to get my Soul Ash and level. Like, I can do both at the same time. Makes a lot of sense. PvP gear power adjustment. Lower item level PvP gear will now scale with higher item level PvP situations than before. I think this is a good change. Now, I don't know how the scaling is going to work perfectly. It used to be that the scaling could actually make people with lower gear more overpowered. So I don't know if they should necessarily do PvP scaling as opposed to just making anybody who goes into PvP have the same gear. That would be better. But because there's a problem right now where instead of PvP being skill based, it's mostly gear based. And a lot of people have been complaining about that, so that's where this adjustment comes from. So maybe this is a good change. I don't really know, because last time they did like power scaling like this, it became a problem, but maybe this is a good. Drop rates of rune carving recipes will be increased by 1 to 100%. Okay, thank you. Battle for Azeroth Legacy loot rules, and then also I should have read this. Introducing Legion time walking. Delve back into the Legion dungeons and Legion time walking to make challenges within, including access to Legion Mythic Plus dungeons. This event will run 2 weeks, so this should always be going on. Like, you should always be able to continue doing these things, in my opinion. But I'm glad that they're doing a lot of these changes. I hope it helps the player base a lot. I hope it keeps people happy and engaged, because all the people who play this game deserve to be able to play the game however they want. I no longer play the game, but I'm glad to see a lot of these changes, and it's unfortunate that it took so long for them to kind of see that they needed to do these. But now let's talk about if I think that this is like a permanent change for Blizzard or what, because I think that these changes are fantastic. I don't think that they need praise for them, because they're things that they should have done a long time ago. They're things that people have been telling them to do for a long time, and they should have listened earlier. But they are good things in the game, and they will improve the game for a lot of people. But is this something that Blizzard will continue to do, and will they always have this idea of keeping the player base engaged through listening to their feedback? And I think maybe, and that's kind of a cop-out answer, but let me explain. So Activision, of course, so Activision as kind of the parent company is looking heavily at Blizzard right now, because they're losing a lot of money for the company. And Blizzard in the last couple of years has been the worst performing sector of the company. And so from that sense, they're going to get a lot of pressure from Activision, where before, if the interviews and stuff are to be believed, Activision really took mostly a step back. Now, there are some scenarios where people say that Activision is actually the reason for a lot of these problems, due to the requirements for monetization that they put on the development team and stuff like that. I don't really know how true that is, but from Activision's perspective, they're probably looking at Blizzard and saying, you better make this fucking work. And at this point, that seems to be listening to the players, okay? Now, it could be that this instills this culture of listening to the community and making changes that a lot of people ask for, or making changes that are very well articulated and make a lot of sense from the community. And also, the new duo presidents of the company probably have a lot to do with this too, because they're from other companies who didn't always have this weird culture of not listening to their customers. So I think that this is the beginning of a long-term change within Blizzard. And I think that mostly comes from a top-down kind of who they put in charge now. And I hope that Activision can continue to kind of stay a little bit back and let these new presidents really see what they can do, and if they're going to be really good for the company. And I think that they will be. I think both of those individuals are going to be great. I think that they are good leaders, and I appreciate a lot of the stuff that they've done in the past. So I think that it's going to be good for the company overall. It just comes down to whether or not the Activision side and the Blizzard side can kind of reconcile this listening and not listening to players. And then if they get this culture down of listening to player feedback in a healthy way and implementing changes that players actually want, and that even if it's okay if the company puts something in the game that's not good or that people hate, that's okay. Just fix it when people say that they hate it. That's where the major problem is. Nobody's asking Blizzard to get everything perfectly 100% the first time. We're asking them to listen. And I think that, like I said, this is the beginning of that. And people within the community will start to see their voices heard better by the company. And I think that comes from a top-down kind of feel. So that's how I feel about this whole situation. I think it's a good sign for the company. A lot of people will probably say, no, they'll just go back. Next expansion, they won't listen to the players. But I really think that the new people in charge are going to make a huge difference here. But that's my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel, because I do a lot of this stuff and it would be really helpful to me. So thanks for watching. Peace.